Thanks, Nichay. While, of course, changes which are happening today in India, while you can look at the international scenario, whether it is the currency, how it is fluctuating, the way we are talking about commodity and oil prices, or effect of Brexit. But if you come closer home, changes which have happened in the last 2 years, Nichay, has not been experienced in the last 50 years. And it has swept virtually every professional out of his field. Whether you call it the Companies Act, the listing regulations, the security-related capital market, insider trading, GST, and you name it, changes which have happened in the last 2 years, a professional has not experienced in the last at least 40 to 50 years. The Companies Act, which came into effect, the new, from 1st April, brought into several new concepts, whether it is the concept of independent directors in an unlisted company, board for the first time being subjected to evaluation, where a board member never thought that he would really have to have a report card or be subjected to an evaluation, or the concept of related party in a completely unlisted environment, getting into the framework of ordinary course, arm's length, and a whole lot of changes. Besides that, where the Companies Act is concerned, if you get into the insider trading and laws relating to that, we have gone far beyond even US. If I have to give you an example, in the US you have a tipper-tippy liability or a misappropriation theory, we call it. If I have a confidential information, I tip it to her and to you, and it goes till the last, and the person at the last takes advantage and trades. In US, that person who's called a tippy would not be liable unless he knows, or he or she knows, that I had a fiduciary responsibility to actually guard that information. I have leaked that information, and that was for a potential gain. Here in India, we've gone far beyond. Here we say mere procurement or communication of confidential information is an offense. Even if you have to have vague canteen discussions, if I am just going to ask you, hey, what's happening? You were sitting late last night, is a bonus coming or something? That mere procurement itself is an offense. So we have taken governance to a different landscape altogether. Similarly, is a case of listing regulations where disclosures are taken into a different level altogether. There are many cases where you have to disclose within 30 minutes, within 24 hours. But all said and done, if I have to say two things which have completely changed the governance landscape in the last 1 or 2 years, if you can say, at least for big corporates, is the advent of electronic voting coupled with the advent of proxy advisors. In fact, Tata Motors was the first case which was sort of an alarm for entire Indian Inc., where they had gone for, and when I'm taking examples, friends, please do not feel I'm being critical about a company or so. It is just to say that that was the start. They bore the brunt, but it was a huge lesson for entire corporate India. So they had gone for remuneration for the late MD who was no more, as well as 2 executive directors. And it was for the first time it got defeated. They had to go back again after a month or two, back to the shareholders with much more information, with much more disclosures, and they got it cleared the second time. In fact, the second time when they went, that was the first time they went with a threat, which very rarely you indulge into saying that if now also if it is not cleared, we may lose these managerial people. So how the AGMs were conducted, how governance was conducted earlier, it was just a handful of people coming in, voting in for resolutions, and majority to the exclusion of the majority. But today, if you have an analysis of the Sensex companies or Nifty companies, you find 80% of the capital today voting for a resolution. That's humongous, I'm saying. I'm not talking about those who are present. I'm telling capital of the company. That is called how you are really having an inclusive definition and how you are co-creating along. So it's no longer that olden times where you can say, I can do whatever I want, I can completely decide, or I can just do a copy-paste in this entire scenario and go. The entire scenario has changed from that to an AGM and prior to that. So how you disclose, how transparent you are is all is all what you have already have to do when you shoot out that notice. After that, you do not get a second time to explain because the voting actually gets over a day before the AGM itself. And in all this, of course, you have a positive and a negative. The biggest positive is while for ease of doing business, India is still at the bottom. It has not yet come to the top. But as far as governance is concerned, we today are rated in the top 10. So on one hand, ease of doing business, we are yet to go there, but in terms of governance, we are in the top 3. The negative part is, of course, which generally the corporates complain, is that there is too much of change, and virtually if there is too much of change, even the best of guys or cleanest of guys can somewhere goof up. And when you speak to the regulator, and generally the question asked to the regulator is it required for you to have a knee-jerk reaction for every corporate default? And the answer given by the regulator generally is that you have to believe in the law of karmic accounts. One bad corporate behavior will lead to one bad law. That's a simple formula the regulator is following. So if you see the Companies Act or the securities regulations, it will be virtually the Salim Javed of this act would be Satyam, Sahara and Sharda. These would be the 3 predominant, what you can say, influences for the new act. And as far as the company secretary is concerned, I think that person has been in the helm of affairs and in this entire journey, right from being a keeper of minutes to a keeper of faith today, I think. So I thought I'll just summarize in few minutes what changes we've really seen in the last few years, and specifically the last 2 years.
So would it be fair to say that decision making is far more complex, given the responsibility that needs to be shouldered by the management team?
Absolutely.
That they are far more answerable today.
Yes.
It seems like a civics lesson, rights and responsibilities being relived, but in a true sense.
Very true.
Because even the manner in which you exercise your right is being questioned.
Correct.
Earlier it was, it's my right, I'll do as I will. And that isn't the case. Plus, I think while we speak of openness, as far as communication is concerned, there is yet that responsibility of confidentiality.
Absolutely. How do you have a balance between the two?
That presents a dilemma in itself, that while we try and engage as many stakeholders with as much information, the know-how of what not to disclose is an equally important determinant and variable. Good, thank you so much, Narayan, for that. Clearly, regulatory and legal changes are causing boardrooms and management teams to think about how they should exercise and shoulder their responsibilities. DP, let me come to you, because the next most popular change is about technology. Who better than you? What specifically have you observed as far as technology is concerned? And how is that impacted or forced organizations to sit up and look at these changes around them?
Thanks. I think I'll pick it up from there. All these changes that we see around us, which is happening, is being driven largely by technology, right? And there is a massive, the pace of change is so heavy that the organizations that all of you look at today will not be in the same shape, 3, 5 years, 7 years from now. They're all going to undergo a massive change. So with the whole digital economy coming into place, and you talked about the voting and everything happening and the participation, is once again been driven by technology. What technology has done is it has sort of flattened the structures. The information that was earlier needed, the functional structures that were needed, somebody was to have an information, somebody was to store. I mean, it's no longer, we know knowledge is a commodity right now. So I think technology is bringing a massive impact on it. You talked about transparency, right? Once again, this information is available to everybody on the fingertips. You talked about confidentiality. So let me talk about that as well. I think time is coming when the rules and the laws will no longer be able to keep pace with the changes that technology is happening. And it has always been there. Laws have always followed the changes that have happened earlier. So what's going to happen? I think the ethics and morality of the organizations and the CEOs are going to matter. Because what is really going to happen is, because information travels so fast, right? One wrong move, one wrong decision, right? One wrong information released, and your business will get impacted, people will leave you and they move forward because it is no longer remains unknown, right? So to me, laws may follow, but it is the moral and the ethical pieces of leadership which will matter. So the way I look at it, technology will require organizations to create processes and systems and everything which works in a very collaborative way. There is interdependence, but in a very collaborative way, in a very agile way, right? In a very transparent way, which means you need to have a completely different kind of organizational design, right? In fact, there is, some people are talking it is no longer an organization which has hierarchy. Hierarchy will not determine your organization. Hierarchy, how are you wired inside, how you operate is the kind of organization that is going to be there. So let me just stop it here, but I think the organization, when you design it, has to be incubator for innovation, and you talked about it. It has to be incubator for leadership. It has to be incubators for how teams work. So the whole design is going to undergo a change. And what is impacting this is technology, and we call about the SMAC technology, or whatever it is, the social, mobile, analytics, and we call it CAMS because to us security is equally important, and your organization drives that as well. So those are things which are going to have a huge impact on how organizations are going to look today, or how organizations are going to look going forward in the next 5 to 7 years. So let me also pick up something that you mentioned, and that was a beautiful start when you talked about divisional structures and when you talked about the functional structures. Let's look at, Army as an example. Army is a very divisional and a functional structure. It's a divisional structure. But when Army wants to, have quick gains, what does it do? It creates commando forces which are sent to create that market for them, or that place for them in which then the divisions can move in. I think in today's very, very competitive marketplace, right, the old divisional and functional structures are being complemented with and will get changed into what is called commando forces, right? In other words, structures which will be very different, which go capture your market, and then the rest of the products, etc., follow. So there's going to be tremendous change being brought about by technology.
Sure. So I didn't cover all the types of structures. There are cluster structures, network structures. These are all new emerging ways of organizing. These were more conventional structures that you find still largely operational in brick and mortar companies. So, but clearly there are different ways of organizing, like Uber I mentioned is a different format in itself. But great, we've talked about technology, compliance, legal. Let's talk about social or societal. What do you observe as far as, Vivek, let's go to the academician. As far as the millennials, the new, the new workforce, how is that disrupting the way organizations operate?
Okay. I would completely agree with DP. On the final, what I took away that you're focusing on values and a sense of purpose. Having been in academia for about 25 years now, there is a distinct shift in the dreams and aspirations of people who are seeking education as a bridge to somewhere. Okay, it could be a bridge to the first job or the next job or a startup or an aspiration, right? I think the millennials quite clearly are driven more by purpose than they ever have been before. So, and I think that's a fundamental shift in perhaps the societal tectonics that have moved underneath. And I'm not just talking about purpose-driven individuals from our elite segment of the society, but purpose is very much upfront, even in very middle class, lower middle class, or even the rural student community that we are seeing. To that extent, since you have given the segue to academia, the old Maslow hierarchy seems to have flipped a little bit, in the sense that I find more examples coming out of a reverse pyramid of Maslow, where we used to think that essentially it's about roti kapda makan, that's the first drive, and then people talk about values. But I think I see a distinct shift in the way people are defining themselves. So I was delighted to hear DP seems to be resonating that when the top is not reflecting that sense of purpose, it is extremely difficult to engage young professionals, young and more so the talented ones. I think again, digitization is fundamentally shifting how people look at education. Of course, the way people learn. We had these monolithic models of, you go to a classroom and there is a professor or a teacher who's supposed to stand for the repository of knowledge. Today, knowledge is completely commoditized, in the sense that knowledge, it is, the Google is the knowledge base. That's the library, okay? And the role of the mentor or the teacher or the facilitator, whatever, or educator, whatever you want to call it, whether it is at the primary school level or at the professional education level, I think is fundamentally changed. And to be honest with you, I think we are far from figuring out an answer to that. I guess your second phase is going to reflect upon that. One of the challenges that academia is, I think, beginning to question is that should excellence be an elite concept? In the sense that, I've always wondered, in the IM system, for example, for a few hundred aspiring positions, you have 2 lakh individuals aspiring for that. And I've always wondered that why have we created this enormous thirst for excellence, and we have only avenues which are very limited. So issues of scaling excellence, and especially, and what technology and digitization is going to allow potential, more agile players to do, is, I think, an open question, in the sense that, and today, if you look at the MOOCs revolution, whether it's a Coursera or edX, you have wonderful content which are available virtually for free. And if you think about it, that used to be a very elite access only a few years ago, that, to get a course from Wharton or get a course from IIMs or wherever, well, you get it only if you make it. But the content itself is commoditized. So, we have to figure out models in which we can really create value through the mentorship mentorship model. I mean, I don't think, we are only scratching in the beginning on the surface today. One example that comes to mind is cricket, for example. Being an enthusiast of the sport, I still remember back in the olden days where it used to be a very elite privilege to be, it was an expensive sport, and whether it is cricket or any others, I'm sure most of you would agree that, today most of our, we used to have a Nawab leading the country once upon a time, but now we have the best cricketers coming out of completely nowhere, starting from, Jharkhand and, Najafgarh and things like that. So I think if cricket can do it, or cricket is, at a world podium, I think designs, we have to have a design thinking to enable even organizations to sort of leverage that kind of excellence in our institutions or organizations. So I don't know if I addressed your issue.
So yeah,
straight up,
one principle, of course, is opportunity maximization. I
Yeah.
think cricket is a great example of how you can present more opportunities, and I can draw the analogy of IPL or cricketing as a fraternity in how it helps identify talent and bring the best to bear.
Yes.
And similarly, in an organization and how it operates today, allowing many more networks to come together in bringing the best that it has to offer to customers. So it's an analogy in that sense. But what I heard you say, and DP as well, and this is a hypothesis that I'll place to the group here, is there a growing consciousness? Is there a growing consciousness in terms of how we should be as individuals? And our values gaining more importance. And I'm not necessarily saying this is only, the millennials. Maybe it's the new era itself, where there is a growing awareness of being and a growing consciousness that needs to be practiced. Are people giving that more importance? I'm just placing it as a hypothesis, since I've heard it now from you as well. And therefore, I presume values-based education will become more popular.
Got it.
Just given that what I heard from you. Dr. Kiranmai, let me go to you. So, specifically as you've observed the environment, is there anything that stands out for you that has had, other than technology, which I know has had an all-pervasive impact? Is there anything that you observe in the environment itself that is forcing organizations to rethink how they should operate?
Absolutely. I mean, when we're talking about the disruptors, this era, while we've talked about, DP touched upon the all-pervasive technology as a disruptor. Look at the social dynamic, culture. What has it done? Today, when we're talking about the world coming together in terms of whatever you look at, whether it's economic on one end, environmental disruption at one end, and then we're talking about, that's a global warming concept we're referring to. It has its impact. But the most important thing, which we also have to look at, is culture. The cross cultures, the inflection points when different geographies are coming together, whether it's as a workforce, whether it's on the political dimension, social dimension, economic dimension, you see it's a huge disruption. Again, the way, and we've added the dimension of millennials. Look at how the millennials, which largely are in the emerging economies of China and India and so on, because these are the larger workforce entering. And then you talk about the mature economies. What's happening in terms of when they juxtapose and come together? There's huge exchange of viewpoints and perspectives, and that is a tectonic shift, I would say, in terms of the cultural. The mindset is shifting. It's no longer what you talk about, what the West and the East. It's no longer just the blending and touching the surface. There's a huge undercurrents today in terms of how we exchange information, how we view each other. It's no longer, India used to be, if I take that example, a decade ago, when we had this entire revolution of the technology wave, we were just the brain in terms of the software or the technology where we were enabling the world. And we were considered to be the high-value, low-cost geography. Today, that's not the case any longer. You're looking at this economy and this demographic dividend as a huge value, and it's making countries like United States and Europe actually spearhead STEM. That is the science, technology, engineering, and math. The huge investments, it's shifting the way the education dimension is in those countries because they realized this is a high potential. So if you start looking at culture as a dimension and you add that layer, you would see how the work environment, org structures, everything is shifting because you're talking about time zones. They've become much more respectful. There are challenges, which we will talk about, but you also see that they started exchanging and looking at each other, and flattening of hierarchies, as DP talked about, clearly occurs. Today you're talking about a leaf-level engineer or someone out there, giving what we refer to as reverse mentoring happening. All these are disruptors. These are unthinkable in a different era. Why is it? Because you realize age has got no issue. Someone who is an young mind coming out of, emerging out of a school has certain concepts and ideas, and you're looking at it from different culture and vantage points. Could be a FMCG industry, could be a pharma vertical, could be something else, and that's a valued nugget. So you started looking at it. Culture is a huge disruptor, in other
In
words.
fact, thank you for that. In fact, some popular literature which is emerging is organization design is not as much about planning as it is about social interactions. And a lot of new age organizations are in fact um, building in a lot more social element into the organization and how it operates. It's not as much the planning, it's the informal social structures that are in fact making organization designs more powerful and compelling. It's gone to the extent where it says, well, you have an idea, you float an idea, there are people who get inspired by that idea, they start acting. When there is enough mass that starts acting in coherence with that idea, an organization design is formed. So it all started with an idea, with interactions, and finally this was a self-organizing group behind that idea. So the purpose element.
No, I think the culture and this piece is extremely important. Sorry, maybe there's a question coming your way. But what is the impact it is having on the organizational design or the future of the organization? The way I look at it, and I think just taking it forward from where you are leaving, with what is happening currently, there is a need for what is called an adaptive culture, right? So let me put that word.
Yes.
An adaptive culture is a culture where you become a little more candid, more flexible, more externally oriented, more responsive to the clients outside. So I think the design of an organization is going to get influenced to a great extent from external inward, right?
Yes.
Earlier, an organization would say, let's benchmark within ourselves and let's continue to improve on, how we have been doing, right? And therefore, let's continue to improve our efficiencies, right? So in the 90s, it was all about if something is going right, don't mess around with it. Only improve the efficiencies, right? This has changed, right? It's not so. Because it's what your client needs, what the market needs, what the product is, and then you move backward into it, what your structure is going to look like. And it's going to be massively different, right? So culture is going to have a big impact on how you create your organizational design, right?
Sure.
So if it's an ethical, is it a highly control driven?
Yes.
So let me explain an example from the control. IBM was known as extremely process driven organization, right? All of us know, extremely metrics driven. For last 2 years, we are only talking about get simple. Doesn't mean we let go of our controls.
Right.
But there is a different way of getting simple. There's a different way of being fleet-footed and being agile. So that's what we are all going through. And that is the culture part of change, of imbibing things.
Absolutely. I mean, I also think of an example, for instance, Ms. Chay, Zappos, a new young startup organization, created something called holocracy. Very innovative. What does that mean? They do not have any titles. The employees there are no managers there. So it's like they're all employees of the organization, no management or anything, no hierarchy really, flat out completely. And depending on the idea and how they work together, people get their appraisals, people get their, stake of the pie, whatever. But it's much more collaborative and wholesome. And it's like one entire community coming together and working it out. Wow. So it's a totally different, innovative strategy of an org structure, which is evolving.
Amazing. Actually, I visited Zappos and they made a presentation. It's just amazing.
Yeah,
I'll talk
it's
about it later, I think.
Wow.
So Shahid is the only person, at least that I know of, that has had the privilege of working both in Pakistan and now works in India. Okay, so from a cultural standpoint, and taking that further, Shahid, specifically as you observe different cultures in action, whether India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. I know you've had the opportunity of working in Tehran. How have you seen that influence and impact? And I'm getting into our second discussion. picking on culture first. So we've talked about all the disruptors as far as the environment is concerned. But more specifically now, it's important to zone into, therefore, what impact has that had on organization design, more specifically. I want to know from you, what did you observe as you were part of these cultures, that it had an impact in the way the organization was designed and operated?
Right, okay. When I was moving around that much, I was part of different organization. And that organization dealt with tobacco. It was British American Tobacco. And then while they had a very global structure and very standardized process and everything, but when for the first time I moved to Iran and where we were setting up business, the conventional thinking is that we know it all. You go and say, tuck, 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 tuck. And this is how things are. This is how things are supposed to work. And you do this and you get result. Completely wrong. I was proven completely wrong in my first week, right? Because obviously every people have their own way of thinking, own background, and that's what drives their way of operating, their thought process, and how they want to achieve result. And once we started to ignore that, very quickly we started to see the conflict that was coming up within that organization. And we stepped back and said, no, this is a very different country with a very different upbringing. The country itself has a very conflicting, contradicting culture because it comes from an era of Shah, which was near Western, right? Then to the 25, 30 years of the Islamic ruling. Yeah, just to say a few things about that country, when you see a woman out there in the public, they're very different to when you see in a very close party, right? So we were ignoring a lot of those things and immediately starting to impose things, and that backfired. So it's very, very important to understand the culture of bringing of that society and adapt your way of doing things, how you organize your work, how you define the structure, and how you empower people. So those are very, very important to understand when you design the organization and design the way you work.
So can you give a specific example from, because of the way the culture was, you needed to do things in a particular way. Can you translate that into a working example?
When we went there and started to set up the business, we started in Dubai. And then we gradually brought the organization onshore. And the first thing was get the talent into the organization. So what do, right? You recruit people, you deploy the things that you know, assessment center. So when we went to the university and started to do the assessment center, and we clearly felt that this is not the right tool for getting the best of the talent, because they are not overtly outspoken extrovert people. They are people with huge insight on any subject matter. They have deep knowledge, but difficulty in expressing in English, right? So clearly wrong tool. Immediately what we did was change this whole tool into Farsi. The results was completely different, right? So these little things definitely started to work for us when we understood what will work and started to change things in that way. And it was a fascinating learning for me especially.
Thanks. DP, on technology, so you spoke about this disruptive technology. Any specific stories that you have in the way you've reorganized, thought about your organization design differently from what it was?
So, I mean, Vivek spoke about MOOC as an example. So the whole, if I look at just the learning function, the whole learning function has undergone a complete shift. It's no longer what it was earlier, and the way we are driving learning and education is very, very different. But let me tell you the whole impact. So as this whole thing caught up, the whole social, mobile, piece caught up, we were very clear that I think we had to reskill a very large, part of our organization. And skill is becoming the new currency. and people need to become fleet-footed, right? We need to infuse the design thinking. So these were the kind of elements which were impacting the organizations from what's happening around us, right? The same technologies are being used in a very, I would say, disruptive and transformative way, right, in the marketplace. New business models were coming into existence. So this is the place in which we are. Now, how do we shift our organization and our teams inside the organization to be able to operate differently? So we sometimes, in a light way, call that our chairman and CEO globally, our president, chair, and CEO, is actually our chief learning officer. So through the MOOC process, I think we started releasing a huge number of small, short videos of what's happening, making people understand what is the whole, we call it CAMS, right? What is about cloud, what is about analytics, what is about mobile. I can say the impact of that is that in the last 2 years, we can fairly say that we are now a cloud platform and we are a cognitive solutions company. And all this over the 2 years, relentless transfer of learning, education, awareness. Now, once you've done that, right, you also need to cater to the markets, you need to also cater to your clients. So we actually, lot of new businesses, or let's say our emerging businesses got evolved from the larger IBM that was there. I talked about those commando forces, if you can call it, or in terms of the businesses which were whole in itself. We used to have, and all of you would know, we used to have a very large software business line, right? We call it SWG, Software Group. One fine day, there is no software group because software is now embedded into every business. So if you are running a cloud business, or if you're running an analytical business, or if you're running a mobile business, right? So if you're running the health business, we've gone into health in a big way. We are into education. Software is into that. So we created those business lines rather than calling it as a one software. So the organization changed, evolved, became fleet-footed, agile. That's what really happened.
I want to give you an example from GE. I think no conversation is complete without GE. So as you're well aware, in GE, a couple of years ago, they operated as independent business units, as profit centers, which had reporting globally. And they orchestrated a change where they brought and collapsed all the businesses into one P&L under single leadership. That was the first time that they did that. Now, why did they do that? They believed that there were greater synergies to be had as far as the market was concerned, because the government was becoming an important stakeholder buying from their various businesses. B, they believed that through coordination and collaboration, that they would be able to ensure that they are a competitive force to reckon with. And as independent units and entities, they weren't being as successful. Now, of course, the jury is out whether it has been as successful as it should have been. But nevertheless, these are, again, triggers from the macro or competitive forces that can help, that force an organization to think differently about how they can work together or should work together. Similar to your story, DP, where software was a business in itself, but then when software became a integral part of every business and how it operated, it was embedded. Similar is the story with analytics. Many organizations begin with analytics as a separate group, and then they believe that analytics should be an integral part of how every business operates. So these are some small examples. Kiran, any examples that you can think of specifically thinking about a change and how it impacted the organization design?
Absolutely, I have several, but what really hits us being in the semiconductor world, 2011, there's something which hit semiconductor industry by storm. Tablet cannibalization is the word. So when you're talking about big form factors or large form factors, as we call, which are the desktops and mainframes, and you're talking about PC and client, that's where AMD as a company was deriving more than 90% of its revenues. So you're talking about a Fortune 500 company which was reliant for 40 plus years, 90% of its revenue being drawn from a particular segment or market, and suddenly you're shaken, and not just you, majority of the players in that particular industry vertical are shaken. The fast pace with which tablets have come in, or the smartphones have come in, which are the small form factors as we call, has completely disrupted. And what's happened? The profitability has shrunk. So there is that paranoia which has set in the organization. The board has actually fired the CEO. This is all in the public domain, so I'm very open to share this. And it was complete paranoia and madness for us at AMD. Then began the strategic thinking in terms of how do we live with this paranoia, but leverage paranoia. So we call it a strategic paranoid, which creates the innovation to leapfrog and move into. So while we continue to dwindle on our revenues and profitability, the transformation has taken place. Today, I'm very, very proud that it has yielded. So the org structure, org design, people, process, capable, you talk about each one of them, tap, tap, tap. Everything had to be thrown out of the window, whatever we have been working with for 4 decades. It's not easy. That's a huge change. And what we had to do is really start looking at the skill set. Where do we need to be in order? One is the survival itself. Forget about anything else. You have to survive. You have huge capability, but in the marketplace where you are, there are no takers. So we shifted gears, and you can see, while we want to be nimble and flat-footed and so on, it's not easy. It's like a giant. How do you move? And suddenly, and to get the baby out, any chip, it's like a human baby. I don't know how many of you are familiar. A chip design takes close to a year. And it takes another full year or close to that to get it out of the fab. That means I'm talking about a 2-year cycle for a product to be out in the consumer hands. So you have to have the vision, the strategy to really look ahead and say, what is the right one and where do you invest? You have the capability in terms of certain skill sets, but you're not in the small form factors. So you can't, it's not like the toggle of a switch. So we had to really relook on the org redesign and several things in terms of reskilling and upskilling. It's not just laying off and firing people. Do we have this? So redeployment of resources. Where do we structure them? So it was networks and teams which are formed. SWAT teams were formed. So it's not just the divisional structure which was existing. We started relooking at the entire org and started thinking, where do we invest and why? And what we've created today, I'm very proud. Any of you have seen a Sony PS4? It's AMD's technology which drives it. If you have played with an Xbox, Microsoft, it's AMD's technology which drives it. And if you have played with a Nintendo's Wii U's, every single gaming console today in the world, AMD has, and we were non-existent in that space when I'm talking about 2012 and before. So that was the strategic shift where whatever we have lost out in a particular segment in terms of the PC and client era, we made up for it through a different business model. But it's not easy. You have to go get the design win from these customers because you're a B2B player, and you really have to, not just the design, but you have to equip the engineers, the entire R&D workforce in terms of how they think. It's a cultural shift as well for them because they're not used to it. You've never done it. This is an entirely different business model because you're working in partnership with a customer and they are giving you the specs in terms of what they would need from the chip design. So that should tell you what we have accomplished in this 3 to 4 year journey, but that whole shift in terms of the org design, we moved from what was considered to be the divisional to really the matrix model, but within the matrix, as I said, it's those teams which form the agility. So we have the agility, we are quick in moving across the geographies, virtual teams, SWAT teams, because they are the ones, because what was critical for us was time to market, as we say, the TTM. We found that execution at the speed of God, and we have to get there when the customer demands it in order to shift that. So these are the things, and of course we divested from the fab. We became fabless entirely, and the recent one, which is again out in the public, is we've entered into JVs with China, because China is where there's a lot of money coming in. So one was an ATMP JV, which we have moved in. April 29th was when we closed the deal. The other one, and again, there was a lot of people and strategy and so on. And I really feel good because I led that from a people strategy and talent strategy on the JV. We found several stories where various multinationals and American companies entered into JVs or mergers with some of these Chinese companies, and there were strikes, there were so much of emotional kind of a baggage when you're talking about employees out there. And we have huge number of employees in each of those plants, and I'm very proud to say it's been 1 quarter, and we're still in the transition services, as we say. And in fact, tonight I'm flying into China again to meet up with the team and sit out there. We haven't had a single strike. We haven't had a single day of shutdown of the plant. Everything is working beautifully because we were able to integrate and understand both from the people, structure, and we've created a structure in the JV where it's not really going to jeopardize the capability or the processes. So we are transitioning the processes. So that's again how the structure is playing a very important role based on the life cycle of the organization.